In this section, we'll learn how to simplify radical expressions, and more specifically, square root expressions. So a square root expression is considered fully simplified if the radicand, which is the number inside the radical, has no perfect square factors. So we're going to factor perfect squares out from the radicand and use the product property to simplify. The product property is that if you have the square root of a times b, that's equal to the square root of a times the square root of b. And our object here is to try to make this number a perfect square. Now it's important that you know what a perfect square is. Perfect squares are numbers that are formed by multiplying the same number times itself. 1 times 1 is 1, 2 times 2 is 4, 3 times 3 is 9, or 3 squared is 9, 4 squared is 16, 5 squared is 25, 6 squared is 36, 7 squared is 49, 8 squared is 64, 9 squared is 81, 10 squared is 100, 11 squared is 121, 12 squared is 144, 13 squared is 169, 14 squared is 196, and 5 squared is 225. You should know these first 15 perfect squares by memory so that you can factor those numbers out from a radical. So when we look at the square root of 18 in example 1a, look at the number 18 and look at that list above. Do any of the numbers divide evenly into 18? And of course 1 divides evenly into everything. That's not going to help us, but it is helpful to know that 1 is a perfect square. And of course 9 divides evenly into 18. 9 is one of our perfect squares, and the remaining factor is 2. Then just simplify the first radical, and we have the square root of 9 is 3, so this is 3 times the square root of 2. In B, 162 is a larger number, and there may be some smaller numbers in the perfect square list that divide evenly into 162, but the largest number that divides evenly into it is 81. So 81 times 2 is 162. It's important that you bring down the square root here when you're simplifying. The square root of 162 is the square root of 81 times the square root of 2. So that's equal to 9 times the square root of 2. Now I do want to show you an alternate way to do this one. The square root of 162 can be simplified by factoring out 9, because 9 does divide evenly into 162. 9 will go in 18 times, and then you can write this as 3 times the square root of 18. Well, the thing about that is that's simplified but not fully simplified. Now remember, we just simplified the square root of 18, and the square root of 18 is the square root of 9 times the square root of 2. So then we have 3 times the square root of 2, which gives us that same result that we got before. So it helps to look for the largest perfect square when you're dividing into the radicand, which is the number under the radical. All right, let's take a look at one that has a coefficient. Remember that when you squish two expressions together in algebra, 3 sitting right next to the square root of 20, that means multiplication. So I'm just going to bring over that 3, and then when I look at 20, I'm going to factor, and 4 is a perfect square that divides evenly into 20. So I'll divide out that 4, factor the 4. It's important, remember, that 4 times 5 is 20, so both the 4 and the 5 must be under radicals when you factor this. So now the square root of 4 is 2, and the square root of 5 is not a whole number, so just bring down, remember you're multiplying 3 times 2 times the square root of 5 is 6 times the square root of, and I just copied that wrong, sorry, 6 times the square root of 5. All right, in D, 8 times the square root of 75. That's 8 times, and now we're looking for one of those perfect squares from the list above that divides evenly into 75, and of course 25 does. So 25 times 3 is 75. So that gives us 8 times 5 times the square root of 3 is 40 times the square root of 3. All right, it's your turn to try some on your own. All right, try a below, the square root of 28, to simplify that, and pause the video while you do this. For this one, you should have gotten 2 times the square root of 7. All right, cool. Now try b. b is to simplify the square root of 32. Pause the video. For this one, you should have gotten 4 times the square root of 2. Now, perhaps you got instead, how about 2 times the square root of 8? That means that you simplified it, but you didn't simplify it all the way. If you simplified and you got 2 times the square root of 8, that's 2 times the square root of 4 times the square root of 2 is 2 times the square root of 2 is 4 times the square root of 2. There's an extra step if you pick a smaller perfect square that divides evenly into the radicand. All right, let's try c, 4 times the square root of 75, and pause the video. For this, you should have gotten 20 times the square root of 3. All right, let's try one more. 2 times the square root of 98. For this, final answer is 14 times the square root of 2. You might have had to look a little bit harder for this one. Just try different numbers until you find one that divides evenly. You might notice that 98 is really close to 100, which is 2 times 50, and 49 is real close to 50. That may help you in terms of thinking of things that divide evenly. And that's it for this part.